A secret route is a road that wasn't on the map. I learned that sentence from a truck driver when I was 23. At the time, it sounded poetic. Years later, it became the excuse I used to justify one of the worst decisions of my life. This happened more than a decade ago. I've never told the full story before, at least not in one place. I've hinted at it to friends, changed details when I was drunk, and convinced myself it wasn't as serious as it really was. But the truth is that it was a crime, planned and deliberate, and for a long time I carried it around like a stone in my pocket. Back then I worked at a small freight depot on the edge of town. The pay was terrible, the hours were worse, and I spent most nights loading cargo while wondering how everyone else seemed to be getting ahead. I wasn't starving, but I was drowning in debt. Medical bills, overdue rent, maxed out credit cards. Every month felt like a slow-motion disaster. The depot handled shipments from dozens of companies. Most of the cargo was ordinary stuff, furniture, electronics, industrial supplies. Every package was logged, tracked, and routed according to schedules that seemed impossible to understand. That's where the secret route came in. There was an old service road behind the depot. It didn't appear on any of the printed route maps the drivers used. Technically it belonged to the industrial park, but almost nobody knew it existed. Drivers occasionally used it as a shortcut to avoid traffic cameras and way stations. Management pretended not to know about it. One rainy evening, while smoking behind the warehouse, I watched a driver disappear down that hidden road. "A secret route is a road that wasn't on the map," he told me with a grin. At the time, I laughed. A few weeks later, I started wondering whether cargo could disappear down that road too. That thought should have scared me. Instead, it excited me. And that's where everything began. For a while, the thought stayed exactly where dangerous thoughts usually begin, in the back of my mind, disguised as curiosity. I wasn't some criminal mastermind. I wasn't sitting in a dark room drawing diagrams. Mostly, I was exhausted and angry. Every overdue notice felt personal. Every shift felt like proof that I was running in place while everyone else moved forward. The depot's inventory system wasn't perfect. Shipments were scanned at several checkpoints, but mistakes happened constantly. A package would be logged twice, misplaced for days, or show up in the wrong warehouse entirely. Whenever it happened, people shrugged and blamed the software. That was what caught my attention. Not the valuables. The mistakes. I began noticing patterns. Which supervisors paid attention? Which ones rushed paperwork? Which deliveries were delayed so often that nobody seemed surprised anymore? At first, I told myself I was just observing. Then I started taking notes. Nothing dramatic, times, routes, shift schedules. Harmless information on its own. Looking back, that was the moment I crossed the line. The crime hadn't happened yet. But the decision to make it possible had already begun. The strange thing about planning a crime is that it rarely feels like planning a crime at first. It feels like solving a problem. By then, I had convinced myself I wasn't going to do anything. I just wanted to know whether it could be done. That was the lie I kept repeating. Over the next month, I paid close attention to shipments moving through the depot. Most items were worthless to me, but occasionally there were pallets containing expensive electronics. Those shipments passed through multiple hands, and every transfer created another opportunity for confusion. I started studying the paperwork process. Which forms were checked manually? Which records were entered automatically? Which employees never questioned inconsistencies because they were too busy trying to finish their shifts? The hidden service road became part of my mental map. During lunch breaks, I drove near it several times, timing how long it took to reach nearby industrial lots and storage facilities. I wasn't gathering equipment yet. I wasn't stealing anything. But every answer led to another question. And every question made the possibility feel a little less impossible. For the first time, I could actually picture how it might work. The moment planning became preparation was the moment I stopped asking if and started asking when. I chose a period when the depot was especially busy. A large seasonal shipment was scheduled to arrive, and everyone expected delays, misplaced pallets, and paperwork headaches. In chaos, mistakes looked normal. I rented a small storage unit under my own name, which sounds unbelievably stupid now. At the time, I told myself it was temporary and harmless. I even put a few old boxes and pieces of furniture inside so it wouldn't look empty if anyone happened to glance in. Next, I began setting aside cash. Not much, just enough to cover unexpected expenses. I bought a prepaid phone, though I barely used it. The purchase made me feel like I was being careful. In reality, it mostly made me feel like the kind of person who committed crimes. The closer I got to my chosen date, the harder it became to sleep. Every detail seemed important. Every overlooked step felt dangerous. Yet instead of backing away, I became more determined. The plan was no longer an idea. It was becoming a schedule. The day I had chosen arrived disguised as an ordinary Thursday. Nothing about that morning felt dramatic. The sky was gray, the coffee in the break room tasted burnt as usual, and people complained about overtime before the first truck had even been unloaded. Looking back, that's what I remember most, how normal everything seemed. The shipment I had been watching for weeks was scheduled to pass through that evening. Several pallets of high-end electronics were arriving from a distribution center before being redirected to retailers in different cities. The cargo was valuable enough to matter, but not so extraordinary that every supervisor would stand over it. I spent most of the day pretending I was calm. Inside, I was a mess. Every time someone looked at me, I wondered if they somehow knew. Every casual conversation felt loaded with meaning. My heart jumped whenever a manager called my name, even when they just needed routine paperwork. More than once, I almost abandoned the plan. But each time, I thought about my debts, my frustration, and the weeks of preparation. By sunset, I had stopped debating. I was going through with it. The actual theft began with something I hadn't expected: boredom. For hours, nothing happened. Trucks arrived, paperwork piled up, forklifts moved back and forth, and the depot settled into its usual rhythm. I kept waiting for some dramatic moment that would signal the beginning. Instead, it was just another shift. Then the shipment appeared. The pallets were unloaded and staged in a temporary holding area while routing information was updated. That window of time was the weak point I had identified weeks earlier. Cargo often sat there longer than it should, especially when multiple deliveries arrived at once. My job gave me a reason to be nearby, so nobody questioned my presence. I moved through the warehouse trying to look natural while my pulse hammered in my ears. The problem was that real life refused to follow my mental script. A supervisor I hadn't expected stayed on the floor longer than usual. A forklift operator parked equipment where I needed access. Small delays piled up one after another. Each obstacle seemed insignificant. Together, they threatened to ruin everything. For the first time, I realized how fragile my plan really was. Eventually, the warehouse settled into the kind of confusion I had been counting on. A supervisor was pulled away to deal with a paperwork issue. Another employee disappeared to help unload a delayed truck. For a few minutes, everyone seemed focused on something else. That was my opening. I won't go into the exact mechanics of what I did, but I altered the flow of a portion of the shipment and made it appear as though it belonged somewhere it didn't. On paper, it became just another item caught in the endless maze of transfers, corrections, and inventory adjustments. The whole thing took less time than I had imagined. What shocked me was how ordinary it felt. No alarms sounded. Nobody shouted. Nobody even looked in my direction. I remember standing there afterward, waiting for disaster to strike. Nothing happened. That should have relieved me. Instead, it terrified me. The fact that it worked made everything suddenly real. A mistake could still be corrected. A bad idea could still be abandoned. But a crime that had already happened couldn't be taken back. As my shift continued, I realized I had crossed a line I could never uncross. The hardest part wasn't taking the shipment. It was moving it afterward. For nearly an hour, I convinced myself someone would notice the discrepancy before the cargo left the area. Every radio transmission made me tense. Every supervisor who walked by seemed seconds away from discovering what I'd done. But the warehouse kept operating normally. Near the end of the shift, I put the next phase of my plan into motion. The hidden service road, the one the truck driver had jokingly called a secret route years earlier, became the center of everything. It connected the industrial park to a network of neglected access roads that most people ignored. No gates. Very little traffic. Just a forgotten strip of pavement cutting through warehouses and empty lots. I remember driving that night with my hands locked tightly around the steering wheel. The road looked different in darkness. Lonelier. More dangerous. Every pair of headlights in the distance felt like law enforcement. Every vehicle behind me seemed to be following me. I kept checking my mirrors so often that I barely watched the road ahead. Nothing happened. Yet I arrived at the storage unit feeling as if I had survived a disaster. I barely slept that night. The strange thing about fear is that it doesn't disappear when the danger passes. Sometimes it gets worse. While I was carrying out the theft, adrenaline kept me moving. Once I got home, all I had left was silence and time to think. Every sound in my apartment seemed suspicious. A car door outside. Footsteps in the hallway. A phone notification. I kept imagining investigators already reviewing records, already tracing mistakes back to me. In my head, the entire depot had probably discovered the missing shipment within minutes. The reality was very different. When I arrived for work the next day, nobody said anything. People complained about schedules. Someone argued with a driver. Another employee talked about a football match. Life continued exactly as it had before. That normality was almost worse than panic. Late that afternoon, however, the first sign of trouble appeared. A supervisor asked several employees, including me, whether we'd seen unusual inventory discrepancies during the previous shift. He sounded calm, but the question hit me like a punch. I answered casually. Inside, my stomach dropped. The missing cargo had finally been noticed. Once the discrepancy was discovered, the atmosphere at the depot changed. Not dramatically. Nobody was accusing anyone. There were no police officers waiting in the parking lot. But conversations became more focused. Managers spent longer reviewing records. Supervisors asked follow-up questions instead of accepting quick answers. The missing shipment had become a problem. And problems needed explanations. For several days, I lived in a state of constant tension. Whenever someone called my name, I assumed the investigation had reached me. Every email notification felt threatening. I started arriving early and staying late, partly to appear cooperative and partly because I was afraid of what might happen when I wasn't there. The lies came surprisingly easily. That realization disturbed me more than the lies themselves. I answered questions, repeated routine observations, and acted confused about the discrepancy just like everyone else. The more often I did it, the more natural it became. Meanwhile, rumors spread through the warehouse. Some employees blamed a software error. Others suspected paperwork mistakes made at another facility. I encouraged those theories without directly endorsing them. And each time someone accepted an innocent explanation, my guilt grew heavier. Up to that point, I had been focused entirely on myself, my debts, my fears, my chances of getting caught. Then I learned something that changed the way I viewed the whole situation. A coworker named Eric had become the unofficial suspect. Nobody publicly accused him, but whispers started circulating. He had made a paperwork mistake a few weeks earlier, and people began connecting unrelated incidents. Managers questioned him more than anyone else. Employees lowered their voices when he walked into a room. One evening, I saw him sitting alone in the break room. He looked exhausted. Not angry. Not defensive. Just tired. I overheard part of a conversation between him and a supervisor. Eric kept insisting that he had followed procedure and hadn't done anything wrong. The supervisor wasn't hostile, But he wasn't convinced either. That moment hit me harder than any fear of arrest. Until then, the crime had felt abstract. Missing inventory. Numbers in a system. Corporate losses. Now there was an actual person carrying consequences that belonged to me. For the first time since the theft, I seriously considered confessing. And for the first time, I understood how much damage one selfish decision could create. The guilt followed me everywhere after that. I stopped thinking about whether I would get caught and started thinking about Eric. Every time I saw him on the warehouse floor, I felt a knot form in my stomach. He wasn't perfect, none of us were, but he didn't deserve to be dragged into a situation he had nothing to do with. I tried to convince myself that management would eventually clear him. But I knew better. People don't always need proof to form opinions. A suspicion can be enough. Over the next week, I made several clumsy attempts to redirect attention. I casually pointed out inconsistencies in inventory records from other facilities. I mentioned software glitches that had caused problems in the past. Whenever discussions about the missing shipment came up, I tried to broaden the possibilities. Nobody seemed to notice what I was doing. Or maybe they did. Paranoia had become my constant companion. At the same time, I couldn't bring myself to confess. Fear still had a grip on me. I worried about losing my job, facing criminal charges, and destroying what little stability I had left. So I stayed silent. And silence became its own kind of crime. For a while, I thought I might actually get away with it. Then small things started happening. A manager asked for access records from several weeks earlier. Security staff reviewed old logs that nobody had cared about before. Employees were asked to confirm timelines and routine movements during the shift when the shipment disappeared. Individually, none of it seemed significant. Together, it felt like a net slowly tightening. The real problem wasn't that investigators had found evidence. The problem was that I was becoming increasingly nervous. I overthought every conversation. I changed details in stories that didn't need changing. I paid too much attention whenever the missing shipment was mentioned. People noticed that sort of thing. One afternoon, a supervisor asked me a simple question about where I had been during part of that shift. It should have been easy to answer. Instead, I hesitated. Only for a second. But I saw his expression change. Nothing dramatic, just a brief look that told me he had noticed. That night, I sat alone in my apartment, and finally admitted something to myself. The biggest threat wasn't the evidence. It was me. The guilt, fear, and pressure were turning me into my own worst witness. A few days later, I was called into a meeting with two managers. The moment I walked into the office, I knew this wasn't routine. They weren't hostile. In fact, they were surprisingly calm. They asked about my responsibilities during the shift, reviewed timelines, and pointed out several inconsistencies in warehouse records. Then they asked whether there was anything unusual I remembered from that night. I could feel my pulse in my throat. What terrified me wasn't the evidence they had. It was the possibility that they didn't have enough evidence at all. Maybe they were fishing for information. Maybe they only suspected something. Maybe if I stayed calm and denied everything, I could walk out of that office and continue living my life. That possibility sat in front of me like an open door. At the same time, I kept thinking about Eric. About weeks of suspicion. About the lies I had repeated. About the person I had become. For nearly a minute, nobody spoke. Then I made a decision. Not because I was brave. Not because I suddenly developed a conscience. I made it because I was exhausted. Exhausted from fear, from guilt, and from carrying a story that was slowly crushing me. I told them the truth. Not perfectly. Not all at once. The confession came out in pieces, interrupted by long silences and repeated questions. But by the end of that meeting, the story was no longer mine alone to carry. The consequences were exactly as unpleasant as you'd expect. I lost my job immediately. There were investigations, interviews, and legal problems that dragged on far longer than I wanted. The money I thought would solve my problems disappeared quickly, while the damage I had caused lasted for years. Eric was cleared, thankfully, but I still remember the look on his face when he learned what had happened. It wasn't anger that bothered me most. It was disappointment. That was harder to live with. The strange thing is that getting caught brought relief. The fear that had followed me every waking hour finally ended. There was no more pretending, no more rehearsing lies, no more jumping whenever the phone rang. What did I learn? A secret route isn't really a shortcut. It's just a longer road with consequences hidden around the bends. If you're standing where I once stood, convincing yourself that one dishonest decision will fix everything, walk away. The price is always higher than you think.